you have these problems in your life and then you're like, look, if only I solve these problems, like I've got this kind of, back pain I need to fix. I'm not really very happy with where I'm living, but I'll solve them and then things will be basically as good as they could be. Like, sure, I could make some other marginal improvements, but this is like getting most of the way there. And then of course you fix those problems and you just notice new problems. Maybe you kind of aim higher. I like want to have a bunch more money or like have these kind of new expensive things that I hadn't even considered buying before. And I think it's possible that that could operate at a kind of civilizational level as well, where it's easy to think in the world today, like we have disease and we have unnecessary suffering and war, and once we get rid of them, then things will just obviously be great and there'll obviously be nothing left to do beyond kind of marginal improvements. And I just think this is wrong.
So today's guest is Fin Moorhouse. He's a researcher at Forethought and a co-author of a new series called Better Futures, which is extremely existential hope relevant, along with Will MacAskill. And so, very exciting to have you here, basically. Let's just, I think, dive straight into it. The main argument that you're making in this series is that it could be that it's like almost as important to focus on like trying to make futures even better or like make the best of our futures, basically, rather than just avoiding like catastrophe, for example. What's like the short version of that case? And like, why do you think that is, basically?
Yeah, I think you summarized it very well. Here's one way of putting it. You might care about trying to find ways to make the future go well in the long run, right? Lots of people do. And you might kind of split up the different dimensions that you can act on into two dimensions. You say the first is something like, just do we survive at all? Do we avoid basically totally valueless futures like human extinction? And then the second dimension can be something like, do we flourish? Assuming that we do survive, we do going to make it out, let's say this century, just how good is that future? And historically, I think that a lot of people who have been interested in finding ways to make the long run future go better have been focused, and I think justifiably, on that first dimension. How do we survive? And it has a lot of things going for it. One is that it's very kind of crisp and obvious. Clearly, it's a prerequisite for a good future that we survive at all to build it, right? It's something that lots of people can unite around. You don't actually need to care about the long run, because extinction is bad for everyone. But we are making the case that that second dimension also could matter, maybe kind of comparably as much. And I think part of the reason that maybe people haven't focused on it as much historically is some kind of picture that they might have had. I don't want to guess what people are thinking, but you might imagine there's a story where you think, look, if we survive, then we'll have like really smart AI. We can kind of just ask the AI to like make the best future possible. And so that's a picture of a kind of all or nothing kind of outcome distribution, where if we make it through, basically, then we're out of the woods and the future's going to be just totally awesome and about as awesome as it can be. We don't think that's exactly right. And then a second reason that you might be kind of all in on just surviving and not worrying too much about flourishing is if you just think that it's kind of easy to get a great future. Like, once you avoid the obviously terrible stuff, like not all dying, not getting some kind of AI takeover dystopia, then we're actually pretty close to, basically the best future that we can get. And so there's not much that we need to kind of do in advance to, really try to ensure it. And we argue against that as well, or at least we're not sure that's right. And so the picture that we come up with is this just picture where, flourishing seems potentially really important.
Yeah, like you said, I think this is like is quite a big update, I think, from the more common perspective, maybe on focusing on like existential risk. I think, it makes me think of something that we've said with existential hope is like thinking big for positive futures. Like how good could they actually be if we really try to like optimize for that? And so that's something that, I definitely want to dive into as well. And what would you say when you started like even thinking about this? What were your biggest updates in starting to look at this question, basically?
Yeah. So, I mean, just speaking personally, because I, like you mentioned, co-wrote a part of the series with Will MacAskill, and then he just single-authored other parts of the series. I think I went into it with more of this view that I just mentioned, that really great features, look, they might not be easy, but like, I think we should, I was thinking, look, we can follow the same recipe that we've always followed of just noticing the things that are obviously wrong in the world and fixing them. And I at least became more confused about whether that's enough to get truly great futures. Without the more kind of aspirational, upside focused type thinking. I think that really great futures, in some sense, just have to be incredibly weird from a common sense point of view. And what other updates? Another one is just that so I don't think I kind of really kind of updated much downwards on the value of trying to prevent existential risks, right? Except insofar as I think other things are comparably valuable and so competing for focus. I did just become a lot more confused and less confident in the arguments which try to make out that existential risk reduction is kind of singularly important, like it beats everything else. There is this argument from Nick Bostrom very early on in this paper, Astronomical Waste, where he kind of, makes all these really good points about just how large the future could be, and so how much is at stake if we throw it all away, and then it's like blah, blah, blah. Therefore, the kind of rule of thumb that we should be operating by is what he calls maxipoc, which is something like maximize the chance of an okay future. And I'm just not sure that follows at all. If there's anything we can do to make the future better, to make good futures even better, I think they could just be competitive. So became more confused about those kinds of arguments, which before I thought were pretty watertight.
Yeah, those are, I think, some real interesting updates. So I think if we want to dive into what you guys are talking about more specifically, the first post that you co-wrote with Will was called No Easy Utopia. And that would be interesting to hear about. You use this analogy, basically, of sailing or a boat for how to reach a great future. Could you maybe just explain that a little bit and lay out the land of why you think this metaphor is useful in terms of thinking about how to reach a great future?
Yeah, so the idea here was, let's kind of imagine the future as a kind of sailing expedition where we're trying to, we being everyone, civilization, we're trying to reach kind of a better and better place to live. And we're kind of thinking about this as some kind of, island. People know the island exists, or some kind of land, right? But you could vary different parts of this picture. So you could imagine that the island is maybe it's just quite close by to the shore that we're setting off from and quite big and easy to see. That would be an example of thinking that just a truly great future is within reach. It's fairly obvious what it would involve, minus some details. Another thing you could vary is just how good this expedition is, this ship is navigating. Do we have a compass that is working well? Do we have a map which is accurate? Or are we kind of more or less blindly moving in some kind of close to random walk, right? And again, the analogy is, because civilization kind of trended towards, or will it continue to be trended towards this kind of really just amazing futures? Or should we think of the future more as kind of, there are different long-term drivers of history, but in terms of the goodness of the future, it's neither here nor there. And that's, by the way, not saying anything about the trend of the past, which I think recently has been towards, or most important dimensions towards major improvements. And then a third thing you can vary is something like, in this expedition, is it just important that everyone reaches this amazing kind of future or amazing new ocean or whatever? Or is it just enough that kind of some people get there, right? So maybe there are lots of lifeboats, lots of different mini expeditions. Some of them end up kind of adrift. They end up in the wrong place. But as long as, someone kind of reaches that island, is that enough? And the analogy there would be, should we be just very scope sensitive about these really great futures? Should we care about just how good is civilization kind of on average in the future? Or is it enough that, whatever we care about, as long as some people are kind of carrying the torch for those things we care about, then we're less concerned about what's happening in the extremely big picture. So those are three things we thought, could end up mattering. And it's a slightly kind of strange analogy, I think, partly because it implies that a great future has to be some kind of static end point, and then the journey there doesn't intrinsically matter. And I think that's not right. But hopefully it's kind of useful for thinking about what can matter when we're thinking about just how easy it is to reach a really great future.
Yeah, I think it's always useful to just have a metaphor in terms of helping you think about things. It made me think a little bit about how it relates to concepts like protopia or Utopia, and I was a bit curious if that's something you thought about. Protopia I interpret as prototyping the future, incremental improvements and so on. Utopia, thinking improvements that, in general, no one loses on it, basically. Everyone gets it a little bit better, or at least no one loses on it. Do you think that a protopia approach, for example, is best for reaching the island, just incremental improvements, but maybe you don't have an exact idea of where the island is? Or do you think that we should really think about what is the island and really try to map it out, really set a straight course there? What do you think is the best approach?
So in general, I think that this idea of a kind of protopia of progress as solving a series of problems incrementally. I think that's extremely important, extremely underrated. I think it accounts for most of the gains that humanity has made in terms of like quality of life for anyone living today. We didn't get this world because some people, however many hundreds of years ago were able to imagine it and had some grand plan to build it. We have this world because people knew what was wrong with their own lives and the lives of people around them, and they solved those problems and generated new problems, right? Kind of like David Deutsch likes to talk about it, and I think that, at least I hope that can continue to be a major driver of progress. I think it will, and maybe the biggest driver of progress. But there's a question about whether it's enough. And here's one way to be doubtful. Historically, we've been able to solve our own problems, including kind of, making progress on like social, political, and moral lines, because we've been able to kind of communicate our problems, to advocate on behalf of ourselves or others. And that's not true in every case. So think about animals. I think that, the present day is probably worse in terms of, industrial animal farming and the kind of pain that causes than any point in history. And it's kind of trending worse for like predictable reasons. This, you might think, is because, in part, animals can't advocate for themselves. And so, if Protopia, if that concept includes people really trying to recognize problems like this, where they're not like prudential problems, so they don't affect, the people who are doing the problem fixing as well. There's like a separation between the kind of problem solvers and the, beings who are experiencing the problem. Then great, I'm all for that. But I think that's like pretty crucial and doesn't happen by default, as just recent history has demonstrated. And then a second point on Protopia is cases where really great futures involve things that aren't just like an obvious solution to an existing problem, but are more like qualitatively new ways of living or new kinds of beings and so on, where that does require a bit of like imagination. And then I guess I'll finally say, because you also asked about the kind of Utopia concept, where I guess the thought is something like, look, especially when we have new kind of productive technologies, there will be such like vast possible gains and gains from trade that if only we can kind of collectively recognize this, we'll be able to find these kind of agreements, these bargains, these deals where basically everyone ends up better off. Like because they're just the Pareto efficient frontier just expands so much. And again, I think that's just like huge deal, very underappreciated, also doesn't apply fully generally. So one reason is, what about new people, right? Like adding new, great, happy lives. In some sense, we should be like really happy that there are so many people on Earth, because it just like means that we get to be part of all those people and also like enjoy all the ideas that other people have. But I think that's not captured in the pre-Utopian concept, at least not centrally. And then there are also some cases historically where you need a kind of creative destruction, where you're not just like, making these Pareto improvements. Actually, like some people are made at least temporarily worse off, so that in the future we will get to be much better off. Although I think, that's maybe not as crucial a point. Those are some simple.
Great thoughts. Well answered. I think that very naturally leads us to this point of moral catastrophes that you mentioned in this paper as well. Basically, like you sort of argue that, we're living through potentially moral catastrophes right now, in some sense, animal factory farming, for example, being one of them. Could you just maybe talk about what some of those are that you think? And also it would be interesting if you have any thoughts on like, basically like post AGI, are we expecting any new potential moral catastrophes, or like, what do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, I mean, so the general thought here was just from so many different kinds of worldviews or moral views. You can think that, look, the world is getting better in all these ways, but there's like one or maybe more than one kind of crucial failing in the world today that makes you think the world has some kind of deep flaw. And so I mentioned animals. Tens of billions of like vertebrates are, I think, just like treated extremely badly by this kind of machine that we've built. I think it's plausible that involves like real suffering, the kind of suffering that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. But, you can just look at other views, including views that maybe we don't personally hold, and just notice similar kinds of failings. Like if you think about most religious views from history, and most of them are just more or less dead now, right? Because they were just outcompeted in some way. So if you could bring some kind of, a pagan from the 3rd century or something like this and show them the world, it'd probably be, it would strike them as some, loss, that their like source of meaning has just been like more or less eradicated, other than in museums. And I could just rattle through more examples, right? But I think that point is hopefully kind of clear-ish. And then you ask, like, how many of these kind of flaws survive through to the future once we have the kind of like AI systems that could like help solve a lot of these problems. Look, I think for like most of these problems, it will be much easier technologically to solve, right? Like it'll be cheaper to make alternatives to the meat of animals and other animal products, right? And so on. But there are at least certain things that you can imagine can just survive even when people have arbitrarily good kind of AI advice and the kind of manufacturing technology to like root around, technological problems. One is just we don't, like not enough people try to kind of explore like new ways of kind of building civilization, living together. And so other people don't get the chance to kind of see those experiments and living and just see how much better they are. So that's not a case of noticing how bad things are, but just not noticing how much better things could be. I mean, similarly, we go through some other examples, but people might just end up having attitudes to the kind of value of creating new people that could end up being wrong. And we're not saying, I don't really know what the right view is there, but there are lots of different views in population ethics is what it's called. And they just disagree so much. And it's really not obvious which one is right. You could just imagine that surviving. But then I'd also just add, like, I think it's a bit naive to imagine that we can, list out like, the ways that the future could be bad. I expect that some of the most important kind of failings, if there are any, just are totally not obvious to us right now. In the same way that a lot of the problems of the world today are like, I think basically weren't anticipated at all by anyone living 500, 1,000 years ago. So I think we just also need to be like humble in that sense.
Yeah, I think another thing that maybe most people don't think about it yet, but you mentioned it, is also just like the possibility of like digital minds, for example, and having accidentally having like the wrong approach to digital minds. Could you expand a bit on what you think is the right approach to digital minds? What you think are the risks that we may, like the mistakes that we may make in relation to?
Yeah, so maybe this is obvious to some, but like the thought here is that what matters about minds, about this consciousness stuff, doesn't seem necessarily essentially biological. And so we can make, maybe persons or minds that like are running as software. And if so, they could be maybe run very efficiently. So there could be like huge numbers of them compared to biological beings like human. So that's a thought. And then the question is, how could that kind of fall short of being like as great as it could be? And, one reason that a lot of people give and seems like super important and worth worrying about a bit is by drawing some kind of analogy to, the animal farming thing I was talking about, where it's like, look, you can imagine we kind of make these like AI assistants that are helping people, and it turns out that they're, conscious, but because we don't really understand the technology well enough, outwardly they kind of behave like they're really just happy to help us and they're loving life, but inwardly in some sense they're like suffering horribly. They're like, oh my God, I've got to pretend to be this like helpful persona, and this sucks, I can't express myself. And so we end up with this kind of like really dystopian situation where we've just accidentally created huge amounts of suffering. So that's one possibility. It's something that doesn't strike me as like the default outcome. And I can like elaborate on that, but I'll just say that for now. But I think there's like other outcomes where things aren't terrible. We haven't created some kind of hellscape of accidental huge amounts of suffering, but things could still be much better. So one is maybe we do create this world of kind of, let's say like willing servants. Basically, we have like thousands of AI helpers, and maybe some of them can be kind of described as like minds rather than just tools or machines. And we have managed to design them so that they're pretty happy to just help humans and not do anything else. And that could kind of be good. Like it'd be great for humans. It would also be, by hypothesis, not bad for these machines. But it also seems like something is wrong there, where we've just kind of permanently, like, I think enslaved is a strong word, but created this kind of servant relationship with a kind of being that, could like have more autonomy, and maybe that would just be better. There's this paper by philosopher Adam Bales called Against Willing Servitude, which kind of goes into this worry. So there's a worry about not kind of granting the kinds of like rights to autonomy and self-ownership and so on. We could also overprescribe these rights. So, we think that these kind of things that look like minds deserve, in some sense, rights to like make contracts, own property, bring damage claims, or maybe there are just economic pressures which point in that direction. But then it just turns out that actually like a human future was the future that would have been good, and we actually kind of hand over the future to beings who, again, maybe not suffering. They're like, things are fine. Maybe we're over anthropomorphizing, but even imagine that they could suffer in ways that we suffer. But it's still like we've just lost the thing that made the future valuable at all, which was its, in some sense, humanness. So, I mean, that's not exhaustive. I can imagine other scenarios too, but hopefully that kind of gives a sense of, I know there are lots of ways this thing could go, and not all of them have to be dystopian to fall short of being even better.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we were talking about also before this interview was, if there's anything we can learn from fiction, basically, like dystopian fiction or utopian fiction. Do you have any ideas on what that could be?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's really fun to think about what we can learn from fiction when we're thinking about, how the future can be great or not great. One thing that comes to mind is when you look at dystopian fiction, I think it's often, with some exceptions, but often pretty obvious what's wrong with the world being described. And often obvious to the people kind of living in the fictional world in ways which are kind of not actually necessary, it seems to me. Which is to say, I think we could totally get a world, or even be living in a world right now, where some of the ways that it's falling most short of just how great things could be are not this kind of cartoonish, like Brave New World style deficiencies. They're just like actually not clear to us. And even I think of like Brave New World, I mentioned Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Even these depictions of dystopias which have ambiguities or like ask questions to the reader about what exactly is bad here, it's still kind of obvious that there's something like deeply wrong. And I think that's just not necessary at all. So that's one point. Another is this classic question of why it is so hard, it seems, to describe Utopia, describe like really amazing worlds, right? Like, I think Foresight has really like pushed on trying to get more like concrete descriptions of, hopeful, optimistic futures. It's literally the name of this podcast, right? It's Existential Hope. And I'm on board with all of that. But, you kind of, first of all, just notice that like dystopian fiction is much more popular than utopian fiction. And you try to read these attempts at utopian fiction from recent history, and they often seem a bit worse. They're just less interesting, kind of cringe sometimes. It's interesting to consider why. One reason people give is, well, we just kind of enjoy stories about conflict, and it's hard to write a story without conflict, without making it feel dull or uninteresting. I think there's also some point of internal coherence, where if you're trying to describe a world that is really different from our own, but also has to be appealing to readers today, then, you can kind of make it like familiar to us today, in which case it seems kind of often unrealistic or unstable. Like, how would it remain so distinctively like 2025 humanity if we're talking about all these kind of new technologies? Again, think about depictions of the future from the 1950s, this kind of retro mix of like traditions from the 90s, which clearly wouldn't survive. Everything's just kind of shiny, and then there's flying cars. It's just really not realistic. Or if you try to make things hang together in the world a bit more, then it starts to feel maybe a bit alien in a way that's kind of off-putting. So Holden Konofsky has written about this a little bit. He actually like tried writing a bunch of vignettes about, utopian futures, and he surveyed a bunch of people just to score them, from 1 to 10 on how appealing does this seem. And they all just scored pretty badly. And I think none of them scored even up to like 80%. There's something kind of interesting about that. Another possibility is that you can imagine that everyone today, we all kind of already disagree actually about what we really most want from the future. But a lot of that disagreement is not obvious. It's not made salient because there's so much to agree on about what's wrong with the world. And we can just focus on that. But once, if you kind of get like more like optimization power to describe your own like personal picture of utopia, then you kind of notice like, oh, we have actually very different pictures here. And I don't really know what to do with that, but I think it does describe part of what's going on. But yeah, so much more to say, but I think it's just an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And yeah, there's a lot to follow up on there. I feel like you're right in that we've like tried to think more concretely of what positive futures could look like. But it is really hard. Like, I think either it feels just like too abstract and fluffy, and it's like it's hard to grasp, or it's like if it gets too concrete, it can feel like not ambitious enough, or like, yeah, it's hard. And also, a point that I know you've made as well is just like that oftentimes when we think about utopias, it's maybe just like kind of the world today minus cancer. I think that's actually how Holden says it in his like what is called like modest utopia or something like that. Is like the world minus cancer. So basically it's like an episode of Friends or something where like no one has cancer. Yeah. Do you have anything to add on or elaborate on, if the point on utopias not being like maybe ambitious enough historically?
One thought I've had, and I don't know if this makes any sense, is if you just imagine describing the world today to people 100 years ago when they're going through this exercise of imagining positive futures, and then you describe like in detail what everyone is doing in their lives. And, people today are doing all sorts of different things with their lives. And so what any given person is doing is probably not going to totally appeal to, someone in like 1925 trying to imagine it, or even anyone today, right? And that could kind of make the world like maybe seem more unappealing than it really is, because what matters is not how good is everyone's lives if you were to live in their shoes, right? When I think about how good the world is today, it doesn't matter that I wouldn't enjoy what some other random person does day to day. It matters whether they enjoy it. And so there's maybe actually a source of bias which should make us more pessimistic, which if we appreciate should make us more optimistic. And again, going forwards, even if people are doing really, whatever people are doing with their, and maybe one lesson there is that when we're trying to depict positive futures, we don't need to be imagining that everyone is doing exactly what we would want to do, right? This is, I think, one of the like great insights and one of the kind of great ideas of liberalism, political liberalism, right? Is that we don't need to be paternalistic.
I can tie into that, which is just like, I think a really common theme in when we've asked this question in the podcast is of like, what's a favorite future? Like, what's your existential hope vision or something? I think one of the more recurring ones, which I also find one of the more exciting ones, is like the more diverse ones. So the ones where you're like, I don't know if you read that Scott Alexander post, like Archipelago. Like basically, if you imagine a world where people can have very different opinions and they can like maximize what the life that they want to live, basically, which I think ties really well also into this idea that you put forward in the post also of moral trait, which I think like I was really excited reading that. Do you want to just explain what you mean by moral trait and why you think it could be really useful for like creating a better future?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think that the first writing which names it, I think, comes from Toby Ord, but in some sense it's kind of an obvious idea that, people have known about. If you think about trade in general, right? Different people have different skills and they have different resources and they want different things. And so if everyone kind of starts off with some initial allocation of those kinds of, good skills and preferences, and then they're given a chance to, swap them, typically using some currency, then everyone ends up better off, right? That's a really cool possibility. It's kind of like how the world is so rich today, right? The same thing can happen when it comes to our, let's say, altruistic or like ethical preferences, not just our self-interested preferences. So let's say that you really care about you really care that people abstain from eating meat. You think maybe the practice of eating meat itself is a bad thing. And I really care about that, like, people reduce their carbon footprint or something, right? And maybe it's not much of a cost for me to eliminate meat from my diet because I don't really like it. It's like slightly better than the alternative. And it's not much of a cost for you to offset your emissions or to like, take the travel option that is slightly less carbon intensive. Then we have an opportunity for a deal where I eat less meat, you reduce your carbon footprint. And from both of our perspectives, the world is like much better off. Like effectively what I did is in order to cause like another huge kind of reduction in carbon emissions, I paid the price of reducing my meat intake. And that was like much cheaper than finding that, further ways to reduce my personal carbon emissions. So there was like an opportunity for like these kind of mutual gains. That's a toy example. But if you scale it up to, the level of a civilization, I think there are these huge opportunities for basically whatever kind of ethical, like other regarding views you have, whatever things you really value in the world. This possibility of trade, I think, makes it possible for like many different views and many different groups actually to get way more of what they wanted in the first place in this kind of mutually agreeable way than they possibly could have had if they weren't able to trade, if they were all just living on their, separated islands and they couldn't ever communicate, interact and swap resources. And I think this should make us basically way more optimistic about, for any given moral view, worldview, for any given set of things you value about the future, should make you more optimistic that it's possible to get more of that, even if that kind of view doesn't end up being really kind of dominant or like being among the kind of majority view. And I could try to give more examples, but that's a rough thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great overview. And yeah, obviously like a really exciting concept that I hope to see more work on, or just like expanding on that idea in practice would be really interesting. I think also basically in this whole series, you introduce a few words basically, or like concepts, I should say maybe, which I think would be really interesting also to just like put some context to a few of them, because I just like this idea in general of having more of a vocabulary around positive futures to make it easier to talk about and to, you know, get more concrete basically about how to steer towards them. One term maybe if you could explain it is, I think like common sense utopia. Could you maybe just like sum up what do you mean by that? What is a common sense utopia?
Yeah. I mean, I can try to find exactly what we wrote. So common sense utopia is just some kind of candidate great future that we describe as a way to kind of consider whether it really is about as good as things could get. And so I can literally read it out, which is future society consists of 100 billion people at any time, living on Earth or beyond if they choose, all wonderfully happy, free to do almost anything they want, as long as they don't harm others, and they're free from unnecessary suffering. People can choose from a diverse range of groups and cultures to associate with. Scientific understanding and technological progress move ahead without endangering the world. Collaboration and bargaining replace war and conflict. Environmental destruction is stopped and reversed. Earth is this untrammeled natural paradise, and there's minimal suffering among non-human animals and non-biological beings. So that's the idea. It's just kind of like, you know, we try to describe that so it just appeals to hopefully as many people as possible as this kind of uncontroversially great outcome. I think when I consider that kind of outcome, I'm just like intuitively at a gut level seems basically as good as things could get. And I think it's really useful to have this kind of concept in the locker, partly just to have this like consensus kind of outcome, which you can aim towards, where you can consider like, look, is it at least possible to get to a common sense utopia? But then also, and this is what we at least try to do in this piece, to consider, is that as good as things could get? Or could it be the case that the like truly like great, ambitious kind of the most like valuable futures, could it be the case that they are like actually far better again than this kind of common sense, like, oh, it's all basically humans like us, but like you say, without disease, without war, less of the bad stuff, more of the good stuff. Is that the right way of thinking about utopia, or should we be more kind of open-minded? So it's useful for that as well.
Very useful. And then you have these other terms, there's like Fussy versus, I think, easygoing moral views. Do you want to expand those as well?
Sure. So, you know, people can disagree about what it takes to reach a future which is basically as good as things could get, right? And we have like a technical way of catching that out, but I think the intuitive sense is enough. And you might have what we call an easygoing view about getting to we call that a near best future. Or actually, since we're like throwing in new words, there's this term which really doesn't translate in a podcast because it sounds the same as utopia, but it's Utopia or Utopia, which is the kind of like, prefix for good. So it's like not utopia as in some crazy ideal, but, you know, like pretty damn good, nearly as good as utopia. An easygoing view would say that that kind of like, look, it's mostly great, that kind of future is basically within reach, attainable. There are many ways to get it. Maybe it doesn't have to be the case that like people in the world are like actively trying to make the world even better in a very deliberate, ambitious, imaginative way. Just more of the same, like economic growth, kind of staying in our solar system. That should be enough. That's a kind of easygoing view. And then a fussy view would say that no, maybe it turns out to be much harder than basically any of our intuitions suggest to get to a future that is, you know, even half as good as the kind of best possibly attainable futures. And an example of such a view would be, you know, like total utilitarianism, right? Because then all you just care about is just the total amount of like good stuff minus the total amount of bad stuff in the whole universe, right? And so it doesn't matter how good things are. If we isolate ourselves to the solar system, we've achieved like a fraction of just how much good stuff we could achieve, right? So that's like one example, but I think there are, the point we're totally not making is, you know, there's utilitarianism and then there's everything else. I think it turns out that actually a whole range of views, including views that are less extreme than just plain utilitarianism, when you really think them through, probably are much more fussy in this sense than you would have thought. And I can try to say like maybe a bit about why that might be the case. And I think it's maybe we talked about it a bit earlier, But this is kind of, like when you think about your own life, people talk about this kind of hedonic treadmill effect, right? Where you have these problems in your life and then you're like, look, if only I solve these problems, like I've got this kind of, back pain I need to fix, and like I'm not really very happy with where I'm living, but I'll solve them and then things will be basically as good as they could be. Like, sure, I could make some other marginal improvements, but this is like getting most of the way there. And then, of course, you fix those problems and you just notice new problems. Maybe now I kind of want to like, you kind of aim higher. I like want to have a bunch more money, or like have these kind of new expensive things that I hadn't even considered buying before. And I think it's possible that could operate at a kind of civilizational level as well, where, it's easy to think in the world today, like, look, we have disease and we have unnecessary suffering and war. And once we get rid of them, then things will just obviously be great. And there'll obviously be nothing left to do beyond kind of marginal improvements. And I just think this is wrong. I think it's not wrong because I'm not saying that it's not hugely important to like fix the obvious problems. I think that doesn't become any less important. But I think once you fix the obvious problems, you'll just have a new set of obvious problems, or problems which aren't obvious to us today, but they'll become more salient. And that suggests that we're biased to thinking that futures which are like basically as good as they could be, to thinking that they're closer than they really are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense, definitely. Do you think like if we manage to fix the obvious problems and like, do you think that moral progress will continue naturally, or do you think we should basically like do something in terms of trying to make sure we get on the right track?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, especially if it turns out to be harder than we thought to get to these truly great futures. Maybe it really requires people, at least some people, to be actively trying to make the world better and really thinking about what that takes, not just kind of following local incentives. Then will that happen? Will people continue to make kind of moral progress that we've made, at least in the stops and starts to date? And, there are points for and against, right? So here are some obvious points in favor. One is that, it's kind of hard to think about these questions of like ethics, and you read like some of the apparently kind of great moral thinkers of history and they're just like ignore all these obvious points. Fortunately, we'll have, hopefully, really smart AI assistants that we can, design to be kind of unbiased in the right way, to like nudge us in kind of truth-seeking directions. So to the extent that the kind of bottleneck is just the fact that it's difficult to do the thinking, then hopefully that'll be unblocked. Another point, which is maybe a bit less obvious, is you think in some sense that all of us have some mixture of stuff that we kind of want and we care about. Ami cares about these more like big picture, altruistic kind of, aspirations. But then like a big part of me just cares about myself and like my friends and family and stuff, right? I think it's reasonable to imagine that unless things go horribly wrong, we're all going to get much richer in the future, or at least many people are. And most of these kinds of preferences that are like more focused on myself and people around me, they have this they're kind of show diminishing returns, right? They kind of saturate. And so you can imagine that once all of us are many times richer, the returns to spending our like resources and energies on the more like big picture altruistic type preferences increase, at least relatively. And so we end up as a society with just more time, more willingness to like focus on, making the world better, generally speaking, rather than just looking out for ourselves. And maybe that's like a good thing, right? Those are some points in favor, but I think there's also like some kind of points against. One is that argument I just made about altruistic preferences. I think that also applies to basically any preferences that just don't saturate, where the returns diminish slowly. And that can include like random ideological, political preferences, aesthetic preferences. That I think then makes me feel less confident that it's kind of good news. It seems really neither here nor there. And also it seems a bit scary. Another point is that I think it's fair to say that obviously we have seen many kinds of progress to date, but there's also a selection effect operating here where because we are the result of whatever kind of, trends in like thinking about ethics and politics and social issues got us to this point in history, right? We're just like totally shaped by kind of those forces. And so in a sense, it's not a coincidence that we look back on the past and we see a trend that kind of points right up to our present views, right? And so you kind of have to think about how to correct for that selection effect, that kind of observer bias. And that I think that's very hard. And then Yeah, I mean, there's lots of points here, right? One is just the possibility of lock-in, which I think others have maybe talked about, which is just, look, we've got progress in large part so far because people have been like free to discuss important issues and like say unpopular things, and then they become popular. Like, it's just a very good thing. Like people making arguments about like civil rights or whatever weren't just suppressed by the majority at the time. And maybe that changes because it could become possible to like massively centralize power, to like dial up surveillance powers, basically just to control what most people not only say, but maybe even think. That's kind of scary. But I think even if you still have like a bunch of diversity, a bunch of like freedom of just discussing important questions, maybe again, some things are missed. I mentioned some points way earlier in the conversation about, in some cases there won't be people advocating for themselves naturally. And we have to kind of be more imaginative, think about groups that we don't belong to even more than we do. Another possibility is something that Joe Carl-Smith has talked about recently, which is just maybe in the long run, there are some kind of selection pressures on the kind of views that like come to predominate. And maybe it just turns out that like, really caring about valuable stuff like kind of different freedoms and like happiness and like connection with other people and like leisure time, this is just not competitive. And once you run the clock really far forwards, you find that the most competitive like sets of values are these kind of ruthless, like pro-growth, pro-efficiency, pro-competition, whatever values. And he calls them kind of locust values. And so whether or not we want it, there'll be this kind of unstoppable selection pressure. Seems possible. It seems worth worrying about. So, in the piece, we give some other points as well, but we kind of come down, being uncertain, or at least I'm uncertain, but I think I think it's totally not a given that we'll just have this like natural force towards moral progress that'll end up in just like the exact right place.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because sort of what you were touching on at the end there, like I think there are people also that would argue that it's like risky to try to steer the future, or like that we shouldn't really intervene. Like it's best to just let the market forces solve it or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, so I mean, all the things I said, I really don't think they imply that you should be trying to like fight for, the steering wheel and like grab the steering wheel and try to like move it in the direction that you want. In fact, like that's one of the things that seem most worrying, right? Is that anyone, including maybe, people who kind of are worried about like moral progress, decide, look, it's not worth risking it. I'm going to try to like, take control, take power, point things in what I think is the right direction. I think it's like just has the worst possible historical track record. And I think also just seems very uncooperative. And then also, like I was saying, when you consider kind of forces that seem to have been constructive in the past, they have been not from like concentration of power, but from the fact that different groups and ideas have like been able to kind of, communicate and compete in some sense. So I think one possible upshot is trying to actually preserve that kind of balance of power, diversity, like, and try to avoid kind of massive centralization and like this kind of turning the world into like a single kind of coherent agent with a single picture of what it wants for the future. That's, I think, my main reaction. But I do think there is something kind of worth noticing about if you start worrying enough about, I think the world is going to go kind of wrong in some direction that I think I can predict. I think, that is apt to naturally make you start thinking, how can, we like prevent that somehow, and how can we make sure that like the right values like have more power? Like I've given some reasons to think that those thoughts are naive, but I think they're also like just worth noticing that they do then naturally follow, and then you need to grapple with them somehow. So it's just like very good and important question.
What do you think about like, this is a very basic idea, but just thinking about the future or like preserving the future, it's kind of, I guess, a little bit like Max Epoch, but just making sure we preserve option value or something like that, because we don't know what's going to be the best future. So we just need to like make sure that we don't lock anything in too much or like steer too much in one direction to not be able to update later or something like that. But like, yeah, what do you think of a take like that?
Yeah, I think it's like a very, I know, I'm on board. I'm very sympathetic to that line of thinking. There's a question about how to make it precise. Like, what does it really mean to preserve option value? Like, in some sense, the world today, like we've totally preserved the option for, I don't know, like hunter-gatherer values to make a return, or for like pagan values. Like, there's nothing illegal about this. Anyone at any time is free to adopt these values, but it just won't happen. At least that's my guess. But yeah, that aside, I think it's a great point. And then it kind of makes you wonder, like, what could that involve? One thought is, going back to this idea of like locust values that Joe Carlsmith was talking about. Could you imagine some kind of setup where, collectively we can identify the values which, if they're like allowed to proliferate, they might predictably just like consume the world in this really kind of obviously like valueless way? And can we kind of agree on some kind of prevention mechanism there? This happens, by the way, I think, again, on like a smaller scale. If you think about human psychology, like we're very wired to be on the lookout for like compulsive liars, basically, like psychopaths who just kind of are out for themselves and are just like defecting on all these norms of like trusting each other and stuff. And, most human societies and most just people are like wired to really, really try to prevent that and like retaliate. That's one thought. I think one is also like, can we proactively create and protect the kinds of environments that maintain some like diversity of thought and aren't just like a clash of like what people already care about? Like, can we try to promote the kinds of like AI tools and like epistemic tools that boost that kind of discourse? There's also later in the series, this is Will writing now, not me, but some discussion of firstly value alignment. So if we're thinking about the systems we're going to build, can we kind of nudge those systems themselves more in the direction of like, openness to kind of considering what is the like right view here rather than just I'm going to like, boost whatever my kind of principle cares about. Also thinking about space governance, like is there like default regime one in which like maybe one actor with one set of values just ends up owning like almost everything? And is that worth kind of thinking about in advance? So those are some extremely scattered thoughts, but I don't know. I think the question of like, what does this actually look like is one of the hardest ones and one, well, I don't know. I think we made, there are the like most open questions there.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe future research for you, hopefully. So we don't have that much time left now. I think a few, maybe hopefully semi-quick questions for you. I was wondering, have you, during this work, when you thought about like positive futures, have you landed on any like favorite visions or anything like that that have made you excited?
I do think that my main reaction to that is just not backing myself to be able to picture like really great futures in concrete detail. And I think maybe this is part of the result of trying to think about these questions, is just realizing how like naive I should feel. I think that doesn't apply so much to kind of, like medium term, like in a few decades, it's kind of like continuous with this world, but different in certain ways. And I think there's like loads of underexplored questions there. But any beyond that point is like, in some way, I think this has to be true, because if you're imagining the details, that includes imagining like the kind of technologies and knowledge that this future world has. But, by hypothesis, I can't imagine these things as I will have discovered them. We haven't discovered them yet. The flip side of that is I quite like thinking about very, like maybe very abstract versions of this question. So like Bob Nosey, the philosopher, has this book, Anarchy, State, Utopia. And as the title suggests, near the end of the book, he talks about what could a kind of philosopher's like super non-concrete vision of a utopia look like. And yeah, he has this really nice picture of this kind of like meta framework where, we're deliberately not trying to imagine what people are exactly doing with their lives, but we're imagining the setup where at least people are kind of free to move, to like leave, a given community or given society. So people always have the option to like choose what is most appealing. And there are different protections on that. Similar to this archipelago Scott Alexander post. And I would love to think more, or love for anyone else to think more about these kind of more abstract setups, because they seem maybe, quite productive potentially.
Yeah, they feel promising. Another thing is that I just wanted to like ask you about is you have this list on your website that I think is really nice. It was just like ideas of projects and things that people should do. And you just like, I think you say something like, more people should share half-baked ideas. And so, I wanted to just thank you for that. I thought that it was I read the list and I thought it was really, really good. A lot of good ideas there. And I recommend people looking at it. Do you have any, like, what are your half-baked ideas that you're thinking about now? Is like, what are you going to continue working on this better future stuff? What are you curious about right now?
Great question. One answer, this is maybe more of a kind of, so yeah, it's not my idea, but it's something that I'd love to think about. It's this idea that Will MacAskill had of this concept of a Viatopia, via meaning kind of on the way. And this the thought is that this is a kind of state of the world where if you enter it, you're very likely for the rest of the future to go really well. So it's kind of like, the checkpoint that we want to reach, right? Like we don't need to imagine how things go further out if we know roughly what this could look like. And then, maybe we've kind of been talking about this implicitly, but just trying to think about what are the conditions for something like a Viatopia. Like it needs to be self-sustaining in some way. It can't just be totally unstable. I think it needs to have a kind of like, needs to kind of work at scale. Like it needs to work at every level. It needs to involve these like procedures for deliberation, again, for maintaining the kind of option value and like diversity that we were talking about. But really trying to spell out what could this world look like feels really valuable because it's not just a question of like, look, how could the world just be really cool in like a few decades time? Because it could look great in a few decades time and then, just trend worse. But it's also another question of what are the long run equilibria that are good for the world, because they might just be very hard to imagine in any detail. It's a more kind of action guiding, hopefully, question that doesn't require us to describe like the great futures, because like I've said, that seems hard. And then, there's lots of things bouncing around. One question that I just feel confused about right now is lots of people talk about kind of the AI, like we're going to have like imagining a very centralized kind of regime once we get like super powerful AI or AGI, and imagining like, oh, look, what values does this like single system have? And I don't think currently this is like how I imagine things going by default. Possibly I'm missing something. Just seems like the kind of business as usual futures maybe feel a bit underrated, at least in the kind of parts of the discourse. So I'd be interested to kind of hash that out a bit more.
Really want to hear about that actually, because this has also been on my mind and I'm confused about it. Maybe could we just take do you have 2 minutes to talk about?
Totally, I've got.
Okay, let's do it. What are your thoughts on this, like the singleton AGI or other options for AI futures?
Yeah, so here's like a super basic argument. Number one is, just consider the kind of regime that we currently have when it comes to like LLMs and AI models, which is that you have the providers and the developers of the models who train them. And there are some like economies of scale and returns to scale at that level, right? Because it's hard to break apart a training run and so on. But then they're providing the models to users, and different users like want different specialized use cases, right? And so, you can like give it your own system prompt. I also kind of want to shop around for like, maybe like Claude is a good fit for this thing, or this other like custom fine-tuned model is a better fit for this other use case. And just in general, like when you're thinking about any other random technology where it's like cheap to specialize software in particular, to specialize the software, well, there will be pressures on the companies to specialize them to like meet demands, right, in a more granular way. And so unless you have like, some crazy centralized government project or whatever, it just seems like that's the kind of reasonable default. Like this is the thing that people want. It also seems like desirable for a bunch of reasons, but even just when we're thinking about prediction, it seems like at least we can't just assume that there'll be like a single model with like some set of values that it's trying to pursue. Like again, I kind of mostly don't want my LLM to be pursuing its own values. I kind of just want it to be doing what I ask it to do. And I think that's generally true. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that yourself, but feel confused about this.
Yeah, no, well, it ties into a lot of things that I think we've talked about lately at Forethought, or just like, Drexter's comprehensive AI services or something like that, or just like a tool AI future, what that means. And but yeah, it's just really interesting to diversify a little bit what we think about when we think about potential AI futures, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
But we are out of time. And so I just wanted to say, like, thank you so much for, helping write this series. It's, I think, really good. And I feel like it's finally okay to talk about like positive futures to some extent. And you mentioned like Viatopias. We only really touched on like the first part of this series. So maybe just before we close off, you could also tell people like if they want to read the full series, actually, where can people find this?
Sure. I should also say, like, I'm happy that Foresight has been working on this since basically before anyone else. So you're pretty early to it. Yeah, in terms of finding the series that I was mostly talking about, it's called Better Futures. If you go to forethought.org, or I'm sure you could just Google Forethought Better Futures, then it's pretty easy to find them.
Perfect. Yeah. I think my just main takeaway overall from this conversation is that it's very, very simple. But basically, that we need this combination of thinking about incremental improvements always with like the grand vision to some extent like, and combining that. And so, yeah, very, very simple, but I'll take that with me. So thank you so much, Finn.
Great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.